Welcome to Arista ACE exam. We're going to talk about switch administration. So some of the learning objectives for this module, we're going to talk about booting and Aboot, that little application that helps us boot into EOS. We're going to talk about initial configuration of our EOS. We're going to talk about some of the ways to authenticate to EOS and to log into it remotely. We're going to talk about password recovery. So what happens if you lose your password, if maybe you're at a refurbished shop and you're refurbishing a switch and you don't have the password that the previous owner put on it, stuff like that. So in the booting section, we're going to talk a lot about Aboot here, which is really the core of booting EOS. We're going to talk about some different configuration files that are available for EOS and for Aboot. We're going to talk about switch booting commands. So these commands are going to be important if we want to set passwords on our Aboot or maybe change our EOS that it boots to. So a bootloader, which is what Aboot is just a small program that its job is to load the OS. So think of it kind of like a computer BIOS or Grub in Linux. It's really there to just get to the next step. And if you can't get there for some reason, you have some ability to troubleshoot and change things to get there. So really, it's a very, very small application. It needs to be simple, small. That's great. We just use it to load EOS. So Aboot is going to look in Flash for EOS and a boot configuration file, right? If it doesn't find an EOS or it doesn't find a boot configuration file, it will terminate the booting process and then present you with an Aboot prompt, right? So keep in mind, this is not startup config it's looking for, it's boot config. So that boot config is going to say where the EOS is on Flash, right? It's going to give you, well, it may not be on Flash, it may be on TFTP or something, but it's going to show you Aboot where that EOS is. So if for some reason we want to go there manually, we can hit that Control C when we get that prompt, and it will put you into the Aboot shell. Aboot is actually a form of Linux, by the way. It's a form of BusyBox Linux. More than likely, you're going to be in the mount Flash for all of your system files within Aboot. So if you're familiar with Linux, that should be familiar to you. So if we want to show the boot config, we can actually do a cat, which if you're familiar with Linux, that's just a way of displaying a file, right? In this case, our boot config is just a text file in our mount Flash directory. And so it should look something like this. So you'll see this is EOS 4.40.1F. That is an outdated version already because they come out with versions, it seems like every 2 weeks. But you can see the image that it's supposed to boot from. Now, you may be able to change this if you want to something like a TFTP location if you want to load your EOS from a TFTP location. Depending on your situation, you may want it on a centralized location like a TFTP server. Maybe if you're running in a data center and you've got multiple TFTP servers, you've got some kind of redundancy there. I know a lot of our sites in my production environment are going to be spoke sites that don't have servers that I don't want to have to worry about TFTP working or a WAN link going down, taking down my whole infrastructure. We have little silos, so to speak, so that we have some services running isolated from our WAN links. So obviously my switches need to have a local EOS on them if I want them to work in that situation. So if your EOS is somewhere other than the local switch, you want to have your IP configuration within Aboot, whether that's DHCP or manual. Usually on production switches, we're going to have manual IP set, and you want to have that on your dedicated management interface. So that's the only interface you can use for Aboot. So whether it's DHCP or static, it needs to be set on that interface there. So some different configuration files. Our boot config is going to contain the location of the EOS image that's going to be loaded. And you're running in startup config. If you're familiar with Cisco, these should be very familiar to you, right? Our startup config is what we save. Our running config is what's currently in our switch configuration. When you first boot up, they're going to be identical. If you make any changes, it's going to go to the running config until you write memory or copy run start, whatever your preference is to save your config to your startup config. So if you want to change the boot config file from EOS and not go into Aboot and that whole process and have a bunch of downtime, if you have access to your EOS, um, you can type this boot system command, very similar to you would have what you would have on Cisco, just your boot system command. In this case, we're actually booting to a EOS on a USB drive. Again, you could do TFTP, you could do um, locally on your flash, you could do on a USB drive. And then here it says, this is what your boot config file would look like for that command. So some other commands for booting, we have boot console, which is going to set our console speed. So if you want to change it to something unique, maybe for kind of like security by security reasons, or some kind of compatibility. Boot secret is going to assign a password to Aboot. So if you really want to secure your switch and prevent someone from physically stealing it and getting your configuration off of it, you may want to set this boot secret so that someone can't just go and reset your password, like we'll talk about in a few minutes here, and get your configuration. So if you do this, the only way they can factory reset the switch or get into EOS is by actually factory resetting and deleting everything in Flash. Reload, of course, power cycles the switch. You might need that if you make a change and then you want to reboot it, right? Especially if you're not on site, which you would need to be on site unless you had your IP configuration in Aboot. I'm not entirely sure if you can SSH into Aboot. So initial configuration, but you might be using a remote console device. That's some cool stuff. Initial configuration, we're talking about console access, remote access, and session management. It should all be pretty familiar to you if you're familiar with Cisco or any other kind of really enterprise networking gear. So we have to have some kind of console access for initial configuration, unless you're using some awesome technology like CTP, which would mean you wouldn't have to use it. But you might want it anyway. So traditionally, you would have this kind of like big, bulky, ugly console cable, and you'd have some kind of serial adapter. This one's the TP-Link one. I like it. I've used it for years because it does not require a driver on Windows or Linux. And so I can plug it into basically any laptop I have on hand. If for some reason my laptop's having issues, I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to worry about network connectivity. I don't have to worry about internet access to download a driver. I just plug it in and it works. Now I've actually got a laptop with USB-C, so I carry this little USB-C to RJ45 serial adapter. It's super slick. It's super small. I love it. It is super convenient. But you'd plug one of these type of cables into your console, or sometimes they're labeled with these IOIO or serial. And you can get different adapters, right? USB or USB-C to RS-232, which is going to be this. I mean, really RS-232 is the protocol, but hey. Anyway, then we'll use some kind of terminal emulation program like PuTTY or Screen. So here's an example of PuTTY. You'll see there's some saved sessions here. You can save different settings, or you can manually enter your settings each time. Your line, which if you don't know, these COM ports can be found in your device manager in Windows. We'll select serial here. 9600 baud is the default. PuTTY is free, simple, it's easy to use. I love it. Some people prefer Secure CRT or some other paid applications. They work pretty much the same. There's just some kind of fancy features like maybe saving settings in a different way that's a little easier than this little box here. But I love PuTTY. If you're on Linux, I prefer Screen. So you can do this little pseudo screen. This is your mount point dev and then your device. And then you'll just log in from a Linux terminal. I don't have to load some application. I can do that all with typing. I hate using my mouse when I'm at work. So as much as I can do inside of a CLI without touching a mouse is preferred, especially when I'm on a laptop running around and I don't want to mess with a stupid touchpad thing. Remote access is very, very important for networking, right? Especially when we're talking about some of these companies that are, international, massive companies. Even when you're not on a massive scale physically, it may be you could waste hours easily on the road, even if you're geographically close. So we want to have good remote access available. So of course, to use SSH, we need IP address information, um, including most cases a default gateway. Unless you're on the same subnet, which I seriously doubt most admins are going to be. You really shouldn't be. If you are, that's a security issue. But you'll need that IP addressing information. You'll need some kind of username and password, whether it's local or AAA, and we'll talk about that coming up here. You'll need some kind of username and password. In Cisco, you'll have to go and generate your RSA keys and put a domain name. You don't have to do that with Arista. It automatically has some generated. You can regenerate them if you're not comfortable with the automatically generated keys, but I haven't had any issues with them. And here's an example of a local username and password, right? Same command as Cisco if you're familiar with Cisco. Username, whatever your username is, in this case admin, the role, network admin, privilege is 15, right? That tells us that we can go have our privileges escalated automatically. And then a secret would be Arista. In this case, you can change that to whatever super secret password you'd like. A AAA example. So this is Radius with local backup. You'll have a Radius server and then put the host with your IP address, your key, which is going to be a shared secret between your Radius server and your switch. In my case, this is Arista's better than Cisco. And then you can have your AAA commands, right? Authentication, login, default group, which is just, you can do different things with that if you want to get complicated, but for the sake of this, we're not going to talk about that. And then you have this Radius local. So what this does is it prefers Radius logins, but if for some reason the Radius server is not available, then it can revert back to a local login. So you have a WAN link down or something like that, you may want to have that kind of backup option there. And then of course authorization, which is going to say that we're going to put these users into exec mode by default. And then we're going to do the same thing, right? We want Radius and local authentication enabled. And then this is just a nice little command that prevents us from having to escalate our privileges or have a password every single time we want to run a command. So there's that. So some different session management options we have. Configure replace is going to put the current configuration, is going to replace the configuration we choose with replace the configuration that we choose. Or I can't say this. We're going to replace the configuration that we have with one that we choose. That's better. So if we want to just say TFTP a new configuration onto the switch and then like instantly replace the configuration with this new one, we can just do the config replace. If we have a bunch of changes all at once, maybe we've pre-staged that in a lab environment or something like that, and then we can just replace the entire config in once. I really love this configure session. So this configure session is going to allow us to run multiple commands inside of this session and then hit one command, commit. And that commit command is going to then commit really all those changes to our configuration. So you'll see if you do configure session, it'll change to configure session 1. You can type in whatever commands you need. Maybe they rely on each other to work. And if you do one at a time, it's going to break something. So you can make a bunch of changes all at once with this configure session command. Your idle timeout, right, for SSH is going to be so that automatically it's going to time out. You don't have sessions left open forever. 1, this is bad for your management plane, and 2, this is bad for security. So we can go into our management SSH, which I love the simplicity of that, not going into a virtual terminal line. I have to explain to students so many times what a virtual terminal line is. It's confusing. It's really old ways of saying things. And they really like it. Even when I was a student, it's kind of difficult to conceptualize what a virtual terminal line is when you really don't have a deep understanding of what a terminal line is in the first place. And then, virtual terminal line 0 through 15 and all this. This is so simple. Management, it's the management plane. We're running SSH. Our SSH settings are, we want an idle timeout of 90 minutes. Now that's pretty pretty crazy right there. In a production environment, you'd usually want something closer to 5 to 10 minutes. Um, but in this case, it was a lab environment, so I didn't want it to time out when I went to go get coffee or whatever. And then, of course, you'll exit, and then you'll go back to your privileged privileged exec mode there. Or actually, let's config mode. So for password recovery, we can do things like remove enable password and revert switch to factory defaults. So removing our enable password, we would need to access Aboot by maybe hitting Control-C on startup. Obviously, if we have a working EOS, we need to do that. We can change the directory to the flash directory, which, in Cisco, you'd use to flash colon /, but in this case, we're actually running Linux, so we're going to put it in a mount flash directory. Flash is actually a mount point in Linux, so you change directory CD, which stands for change directory, and then mount flash or MNT if you want to spell it out, /flash. Then we're going to either edit or change the name of the startup config, right? So you kind of have two options. I hate V. I'm not a big fan of it. But if you're a V person and you want to just jump in there and comment out the line with enable password, that's fine. I prefer just moving the startup config to startupconfig.old, and then you can do that config replace once you've escalated your privileges in EOS with the old config. Super easy, right? So then, of course, you exit Aboot, which reboots the switch, and then hopefully you are going to go get into EOS without an issue. So if we have an unknown Aboot password, right, we talked about setting that earlier for security reasons, we can boot into Aboot with Control-C, type in the password 3 times wrong, and then we'll have the option to hit the full recover command. It's going to delete everything in your flash directory. Keep in mind, this is going to remove your EOS version, your configuration, your boot config, your ZTP config, some logs, and everything else put there. So if there's any kind of certificates or anything, especially if you're very security conscious, you've got certificates on all of your switches, you want to put them in flash and set your Aboot password so that if someone has got physical access to your switch, maybe they stole it, maybe they got it from some kind of recycle factory or something, some kind of maybe they work at some kind of refurbishing place, and they get it and they're like, hey, I see this certificate is still valid for 3 months or whatever. Maybe I can use it to compromise something in their network. So we want to be careful with that. Put it in your flash directory, set your Aboot password. That will protect you from getting that stolen, assuming your Aboot password isn't something stupid like Arista, like we just talked about, or Cisco. Set a good Aboot password, right? So this will not only set your configuration back, it will set your EOS back as well. So keep that in mind. You'll get whatever shipped originally with that switch. You can also remove the Aboot password from EOS if you have access with the no boot secret command. So if you have access to EOS but not Aboot, so like there's an Aboot password but they didn't set a password on EOS because they're a terrible security administrator and they obviously need to get better, get good, then you can just do that no boot secret and then bam, it's gone. So keep in mind you need to secure both Aboot and EOS. So some terms and concepts from this module. You should be familiar afterwards. If you're not, go back, review, go Google some stuff, go read the Arista Warrior book. It's a really awesome book. It's got a lot of good information in there. You should know what Grub or a bootloader is, right? Aboot's our bootloader. Flash, and that's in our mount point and then flash. What the full recover command does, right? Console speed, boot secret, boot console, what SSH is, right? Hopefully you know what that is at this point. What the configure place and configure session do. Of course, your console information, right? Your internal emulation program, maybe part of your screen that you're using. All these should be familiar to you after this. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next module.